May 1945. A thin mist hangs over a captured American barracks on the edge of a small town in Bavaria. The war has ended only days earlier, but the air still carries the smell of burnt fuel, damp earth, and a silence that feels heavier than gunfire ever did. Wooden doors creak open as a column of German women, exhausted, hollow-eyed, their clothes worn from weeks of flight and surrender, are marched toward the building they never imagined entering under these conditions. Inside, the barracks lie in disarray, mud tracked across the floors, broken bedding, piles of discarded rations, papers, and equipment abandoned during the frantic final days of the advance. The women pause at the doorway, their faces tightening with a mixture of fear and disbelief. For years, these rooms belonged to an army they were taught to fear. Now they must clean them under the watchful eyes of their former enemies. An American sergeant steps aside, giving a curt gesture toward the mess inside. The women hesitate only for a moment before stepping forward, aware they have no choice. And to understand how this moment came to be, how defeat, collapse, and occupation converged on these women, we must return to the world Germany had become in the final weeks of the war. By the spring of 1945, Germany was no longer a functioning nation, but a landscape of collapse. Entire cities lay flattened under months of Allied bombing. Roads once crowded with military convoys now carried endless streams of refugees, wounded soldiers, and civilians fleeing blindly from the advancing fronts. In the West, American and British forces pushed deeper into Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg, meeting only scattered resistance. In the East, the Red Army tore through the last defensive lines. What remained of German authority crumbled hour by hour. Amid this chaos, thousands of German women found themselves pulled directly into the whirlwind of surrender. Some had served in auxiliary roles for the Wehrmacht or Luftwaffe, clerks, mess staff, signal operators, medical assistants. Others were members of the Reich Labor Service or local Volkssturm support groups, assigned tasks far from combat but still tied to the German war machine. Many were simply civilians caught inside areas designated for mass capitulation, as American units secured towns and military complexes. For the U.S. Army, the distinction often blurred. In the immediate post-surrender confusion, anyone associated with a military installation could be treated as a prisoner or detainee until properly processed. American commanders faced an overwhelming problem. They were occupying a devastated nation without the luxury of waiting for administrative order. Barracks taken over by U.S. forces were often in a state of neglect or chaos. Some had been abandoned in haste when German troops fled. Others had been used as makeshift shelters during the final battles. Floors were coated with layers of dust, oil, and debris. Bedding was torn or infested. Latrines were clogged, broken, or overflowing. Equipment was scattered across rooms with no clear system of storage. The U.S. Army did not have the personnel to clean and restore each facility while also managing supply lines, processing prisoners, and securing their zones of occupation. Under SHAFE regulations, prisoners of war could be assigned non-hazardous labor essential for military operations. This included everything from agricultural work to cleaning tasks inside camps and barracks. Although female POWs were less common than male prisoners, their numbers grew significantly in April and May 1945 as entire auxiliary units surrendered. Many were young, some barely in their late teens. Others, older women who had volunteered or been drafted into support work as Germany's manpower collapsed. These women arrived at American-controlled sites in varying conditions. Some had marched for days with little food, carrying only what they could salvage. Others had been trapped inside military buildings when the Germans withdrew and were taken into custody on the spot. For the U.S. Army, they were a labor force at a time when every manpower shortage felt critical. For the women, it was the beginning of a humiliating descent from structured wartime roles into the uncertain status of prisoners forced to serve their conquerors. The psychological shock was immense. For years, propaganda had painted American soldiers as brutal, undisciplined, or morally dangerous. Yet the reality they encountered was different, structured, firm, but rarely violent. Still, there was no kindness in defeat. When the order came to clean the barracks, it came without discussion. Women who had worked as clerks or signal operators were suddenly told to scrub floors and latrines. Former Red Cross helpers found themselves hauling buckets of water or removing trash left behind by fleeing German troops. Some felt shame, others anger, but all understood the unspoken message. Germany had fallen, and they now existed at the bottom of that reality. In towns across southern Germany, similar scenes unfolded. American units moved into intact or partially intact barracks, assessed the damage, and immediately sought labor to restore them. Sometimes men and women were assigned separately. Other times, women worked exclusively inside buildings where American soldiers lived, slept, and ate. Tensions varied from place to place. Some U.S. units maintained strict professionalism. Others allowed resentment, shaped by months of combat, to seep into their treatment of prisoners. For the women, each task carried a constant awareness of vulnerability, strangers commanding them, unfamiliar expectations, and the absence of any authority to appeal to. By early summer, thousands of German women across multiple occupied zones were involved in cleaning, sorting, and restoring American military facilities. Their labor helped transform chaotic, war-torn buildings into functioning centers of administration and supply. But behind the practical need was the undeniable imbalance of power, the victors ordering the defeated to tidy the very spaces that symbolized occupation. It was a practical measure, yet for those who endured it, felt deeply personal. And to understand how these women were processed, assigned, and controlled during this period, we must examine how American occupation procedures formally structured their use as forced labor. The American occupation of Germany in 1945 unfolded under a mixture of formal regulations and improvised decisions made on the ground. SHAEF, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, had established clear categories for those captured in the collapse of the Reich: prisoners of war, disarmed enemy forces, civilian internees, and detained persons pending classification. The reality, however, was far less orderly. Entire towns surrendered in waves, with military personnel, local administrators, auxiliary staff, and regular civilians often mixed together. For frontline American units, the priority was security and immediate stabilization, not the slow and delicate process of distinguishing each individual's wartime role. This administrative ambiguity became the backdrop against which thousands of German women were assigned labor tasks. Many did not fit neatly into traditional POW categories. Some wore uniforms, but they were not combatants. Others possessed documents linking them to military agencies, but their duties had been clerical or supportive rather than operational. A growing number were simply civilians living near military installations who happened to be swept up in mass capitulations. Still, U.S. occupation policy allowed commanders to employ all enemy personnel under military control in necessary non-combat labor. Cleaning barracks quickly became one of the most widespread assignments. American companies arriving at newly captured sites often found facilities in a state of neglect that interfered with their operations. Soldiers needed clean sleeping quarters, secure storage rooms, sanitized kitchens, and functional administrative spaces. The war had only just ended, but the U.S. military machine could not pause. Supply depots, command posts, and logistical centers had to be established in order to govern an occupied territory the size of a nation. Female prisoners were seen as more suitable for internal cleaning tasks, not because of explicit policy, but through the assumptions of the era. American commanders viewed men, especially former Wehrmacht soldiers, as more likely to resist or sabotage. Women, in their view, were less threatening and more manageable, particularly in the vulnerable environment of close contact indoor labor. These assumptions shaped daily assignments, creating a pattern across multiple occupation zones where German women cleaned, scrubbed, restored, and organized buildings that would soon house the soldiers of the conquering army. The work was physically demanding. Many facilities had been used as temporary field hospitals or troop quarters during the final months of fighting, leaving behind blood-stained bedding, broken equipment, and refuse from hurried evacuations. In other places, German soldiers had burned documents, leaving layers of ash coating floors and walls. The women were provided with simple tools: buckets, rags, brushes, soap, and sometimes only cold water. They worked for hours, often under supervision, their movements monitored, not out of cruelty, but because the U.S. Army could not risk disorder while the occupation was still fragile. In some towns, Red Cross observers later noted that conditions for these women blurred the line between POW labor and punitive humiliation. Though international law permitted labor assignments, it also required humane treatment. American compliance varied. Many units followed regulations, ensuring prisoners received food, rest, and basic respect. Others, worn down by the emotional weight of combat, viewed the labor of German women as a symbolic reversal, an unspoken reminder that the war had permanently shifted the balance of power. For the women, the emotional toll was complicated. Some accepted the tasks quietly, relieved simply to be alive after months of bombings, shortages, and fear of approaching Soviet troops. Others felt deeply humiliated. Cleaning American barracks meant kneeling on floors where enemy soldiers slept, handling their discarded items, and performing tasks that forced them into a posture of subordination. The psychological contrast between the harsh propaganda they had grown up with and the structured but firm reality of American authority created a disorienting experience. Yet not all interactions were hostile. Diaries written by American soldiers reveal a mix of frustration, pity, curiosity, and even indifference. Some soldiers expressed discomfort at the sight of women performing labor in uniforms of defeat. Others remained strictly professional, focused solely on restoring order. A few recorded moments of tension, arguments over work pace, gestures misinterpreted, or refusals met with stern warnings. Each small incident reflected a broader clash of worlds, a defeated nation trying to navigate survival under foreign command, and an occupying army balancing responsibility with the remnants of wartime resentment. Despite the varied treatment, one truth remained constant. These women had entered a system that cared little for their wartime identities. Their past roles, clerks, radio operators, nurses, held no meaning here. To the military administration, they were simply manpower in a country where manpower had collapsed. Their tasks inside American barracks would become one of the most symbolic expressions of Germany's defeat, not because of violence, but because of the complete reversal of status it represented. And it is through this lens of human vulnerability, tactical necessity, and cultural collision that the deeper angles of this story emerge, revealing the layered experiences behind what at first glance appears to be a simple assignment. For the women placed inside American barracks, the humiliation was not always rooted in the physical task of cleaning. It was the symbolism behind it. Many had grown up in a society that stressed discipline, order, and national pride. They had been taught that Germany was strong, unbreakable, destined to lead Europe through resolve and unity. But in the spring of 1945, as they scrubbed floors beneath the boots of their conquerors, that identity collapsed in real time. Fatigue shaped every movement. Some women had eaten little more than a piece of stale bread in the days before surrender. Others were mothers, separated from their children during evacuations or chaotic flights from advancing fronts. Their thoughts drifted constantly between survival and fear of the unknown. Inside the barracks, their silence spoke louder than any argument. Each one understood that resistance could bring discipline, punishment, or reassignment. The presence of American guards only deepened the emotional weight. The soldiers were not cruel, but their authority was unmistakable. A gesture, a command. Even the sound of their boots on the wooden floor was a reminder of the total shift in power. For the women, every task, lifting a bucket, wiping a table, opening a window to clear the lingering odor of war, carried the same message. The world they knew was gone. This deeply personal humiliation became an unrecorded chapter of defeat, remembered not through official reports, but through quiet moments of exhaustion. Trembling hands and the forced acceptance of a new reality. And behind this human experience stood the immense logistical machinery of the U.S. Army, which required order before reflection. From the perspective of American commanders, assigning German women to clean the barracks was not about symbolism. It was about immediate operational need. The U.S. Army had advanced rapidly across southern Germany, pushing through towns and villages while relying on makeshift facilities for sleeping, planning, and supply management. With the war ending abruptly, units needed stable and sanitary locations from which to coordinate their new role as an occupying force. Many of the barracks they took over were not only dirty, but functionally unusable. Floors were coated with grime from months of military use. Latrines were damaged or overflowing. Cots were broken, blankets torn, and walls marked by smoke, dust, and the stains of burned documents. In some cases, American soldiers had been sleeping outdoors or in drafty industrial halls until suitable buildings could be restored. Commanders faced a simple equation. Every man assigned to clean was a man unavailable for essential security duties. Yet the barracks had to be made operational quickly. German women, already gathered in holding areas or found inside recently surrendered bases, were the most immediate source of labor. They could be assigned tasks that required little training yet produced fast results. This decision was rooted in military logic rather than malice. The faster a barracks was restored, the sooner it could support company-level operations, intelligence work, supply distribution, or administrative coordination for the occupation zone. American officers recorded these labor assignments in logs with detached precision. To them, the work was a matter of restoring efficiency to a moving army. Still, the tactical necessity could not erase the emotional pain felt by the women performing these tasks. And that tension grew more pronounced once cultural expectations collided inside those walls. The encounter between American soldiers and German women inside the barracks was more than an exchange of orders. It was the collision of two vastly different worlds, shaped by years of propaganda, fear, and wartime ideology. Many German women entered captivity believing that Americans were violent, undisciplined, or morally reckless. These views, drilled into the population by Nazi propaganda, created a heightened sense of fear when they first saw American uniforms. Yet what they encountered was often a strict military routine: guards who enforced order, officers who issued short instructions, and soldiers who performed their duties with little interest in conversation. The discrepancy between expectation and reality created a strange psychological dissonance. For American soldiers, the cultural shock was equally strong. They had spent months fighting a brutal war, losing friends in Normandy, the Ardennes, the Saar, and the final plains of central Germany. To see German women, some in military-style uniforms, others in civilian clothing, entering the barracks as laborers, evoked a mixture of distrust and curiosity. Soldiers often watched them work in silence, unsure how to interact with the defeated population without compromising discipline. Language barriers only intensified the tension. Simple instructions became long gestures or repeated commands. Misunderstandings led to brief confrontations, moments of frustration, or rigid expressions of authority. These encounters were rarely violent, but always charged with the emotion of immediate post-war disorder. Inside the barracks, the clash of cultures played out in hundreds of tiny interactions, each carrying the weight of a continent adjusting to peace. And it was within these layers of human struggle, military need, and cultural friction that the deeper, more complex angles of this story take shape. The presence of German women inside American barracks exposed a rarely discussed dimension of the war's end: the gendered experience of defeat. In 1945, German society had placed women in a peculiar position. They were expected to embody national purity, discipline, and moral strength, even as the nation crumbled around them. Yet when the surrender came, these same women found themselves powerless, stripped not only of national identity, but of personal autonomy. Inside the barracks, the gender imbalance was unmistakable. The women worked in spaces designed for men, surrounded by the tools, uniforms, and presence of an occupying army. There was no privacy, no sense of control, and no certainty about the boundaries of authority. Every instruction, even when delivered calmly, carried an underlying tension shaped by both vulnerability and historical fear. Many American soldiers were aware of this imbalance and acted with restraint. But gender alone created a psychological landscape loaded with sensitivity. Women who had operated radios, sorted files, or served in auxiliary medical roles found themselves cleaning latrines or scrubbing floors. These tasks were physically demanding, but their deeper impact came from the reversal of role and identity. This intersection of gender and defeat became one of the most enduring emotional scars from the early occupation. Yet beneath this human vulnerability was a far more complex question. How far were these labor assignments justified within the moral and legal frameworks of 1945? The assignment of German women to clean American barracks sits at the crossroads of legality and morality. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be required to perform non-dangerous labor beneficial to the occupying force. Cleaning, carrying supplies, and maintaining facilities all fell within acceptable boundaries. From a legal standpoint, the U.S. Army operated well within international guidelines, but legality did not erase the moral discomfort surrounding the situation. These were not captured combat troops, but often clerks, nurses, teenage auxiliaries, or civilians caught inside military zones at the moment of surrender. Some of them had never handled weapons or participated in any military action. The The blunt classification of these women as enemy personnel was administratively efficient, yet morally complex. For American units, the practical argument dominated. Someone had to clean the barracks, and their own troops were needed for securing towns, escorting disarmed men and stabilizing transport routes. But for the women, the experience felt less like legal labor and more like ritual humiliation, a reminder that they belonged to a defeated population whose dignity came second to the needs of the occupiers. Historians continue to debate this period, noting that the thin line between necessity and punishment shaped how many women remembered these days. And from the moral dimension emerges the last angle, the way American soldiers themselves perceived this unprecedented interaction. To the men of the U.S. Army, the presence of German women cleaning their barracks produced feelings shaped not only by duty, but by months of battle. Many had fought through Normandy's hedgerows, endured freezing nights in the Ardennes, or pushed across the Rhine under fire. Their impressions of Germany were formed through loss, exhaustion, and brief glimpses of an enemy that had resisted fiercely until the final hour. Seeing German women enter the barracks with buckets and brushes created a strange emotional shift. Some soldiers viewed the labor as simple necessity, an efficient way to restore order. Others felt an unspoken sense of justice, shaped by memories of friends buried in faraway fields. A few expressed discomfort, uneasy at the sight of defeated women performing tasks under armed supervision. Yet most soldiers remained pragmatic. Their diaries and letters home describe the women with brief observational language. Quiet, tired, worked fast, did what we told them. There was no triumphalism nor sympathy in excess, only the detached tone of men trying to adapt to a world where the enemy had become a population to manage rather than an army to defeat. This American perspective, shaped by hardship and responsibility, set the stage for the tensions that soon peaked inside certain barracks, moments when exhaustion, misunderstanding, and the memory of war converged into a decisive turning point. By mid-May 1945, the American occupation of southern Germany had settled into a tense rhythm. Towns were secured, roadblocks established, and disarmed soldiers processed in long columns stretching toward makeshift holding areas. But inside certain barracks, especially those captured intact, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. The women assigned to clean these facilities were exhausted, frightened, and still adjusting to the daily presence of an occupying force. The American soldiers, equally weary from months of combat, often operated on edge, balancing duty with the residue of wartime anger. One morning in a former Wehrmacht training barracks outside Regensburg, the growing tension finally broke the thin layer of calm. The building had once served as a logistics hub, its long wooden corridors lined with storage rooms and administrative offices. Weeks of chaos had turned it into a warehouse of abandoned equipment. Torn maps, ration tins, blankets, rusted helmets, and crates of soaked paperwork stacked chaotically against the walls. When American forces occupied the complex, they designated it as a temporary quarters for 2 companies and ordered a group of German women to make it habitable as quickly as possible. The work had already lasted several days. The women were sore, their hands scraped from handling debris, their clothes marked with water stains and ash. Some worked in silence. Others whispered nervously as they navigated narrow hallways under the watch of American guards. The soldiers tried to maintain order, but the atmosphere was thick with fatigue on both sides. That morning, the tension surged when the cleaning group was instructed to clear an area at the far end of the corridor. a room filled knee-deep with discarded gear left behind by German troops who had fled only hours before surrender. Inside the room, the air was stale and heavy. The floor was covered in broken wooden crates, shredded uniforms, medical kits, rags soaked in fuel, and piles of half-burned documents. The women hesitated at the doorway. The task felt overwhelming, even dangerous, with splintered wood and sharp metal scattered underfoot. One young woman, barely 20, shook her head instinctively. Another stepped back, whispering that they needed proper tools. An American sergeant, himself worn from long weeks of patrol duty, interpreted the hesitation differently. To him, it was not fear, it was refusal. The war had taught him to read hesitation as resistance, and resistance as a threat. His voice rose sharply as he ordered them inside. The women flinched, stepping backward again, their faces pale under the dim light. The sergeant's reaction was immediate. He ordered the guards to close the hallway, ensuring no one left until the work was done. The atmosphere changed instantly. Fear replaced reluctance. The women realized they were no longer performing simple labor. They were being confronted with the authority and impatience of an occupying army still adjusting to its new role. When the women finally entered the cluttered room, the situation grew more chaotic. One woman cut her hand on a piece of broken metal. Another stumbled on a loose plank. The sergeant, frustrated and perceiving disorganization as defiance, barked orders in a language most of the women barely understood. Confusion swelled. Voices rose. A metal crate crashed to the floor. Dust and ash filled the air in a cloud that made the women cough, their eyes watering. A young German woman near the back, overwhelmed and trembling, muttered something in her dialect, something the sergeant couldn't understand. He stepped forward abruptly, grabbing the edge of a crate to clear space. The sudden movement startled several women, triggering a chain reaction of panic. What followed was not violence, and yet it felt perilously close. A moment in which fear, misunderstanding, and exhaustion collided. One of the American guards intervened first. He raised a hand toward the sergeant, quietly reminding him that the women had been working for days without rest. The sergeant paused, breathing heavily, his frustration visible, but slowly receding under the weight of his subordinate's calm. The room fell silent, except for the crackle of broken wood under the women's shoes. It was a turning point, not of battle, but of morale. The American soldiers realized that pushing too hard risked destabilizing an already fragile environment. The women, in turn, understood the precariousness of their position. This moment shaped how both sides approached each other in the days that followed. Guards adopted a more measured tone, issuing clearer instructions and allowing brief pauses for rest. The women worked with renewed determination, aware that their endurance influenced how they were treated. But not all barracks saw such restraint. In other towns across Bavaria, similar incidents unfolded. Moments when frustration or humiliation flared into confrontation before cooling again under the expectation of discipline. These scenes would become the emotional epicenter of the occupation's early weeks. Defining how defeated German auxiliaries remembered their transition from a collapsing Reich into the authority of the Allied armies. And as May turned to June, the psychological strain inside these barracks reached another breaking moment, one that would expose the full weight of defeat, occupation, and survival. The story of German women assigned to American barracks cannot be understood without tracing the collapse of the German home front. A breakdown that turned millions of civilians into a drifting population of the defeated. By mid-1945, Germany was a country of ruins, operating in a condition Allied planners described as a society incapable of functioning without external control. Cities were pulverized, transport systems shattered, and food supplies interrupted by months of aerial bombardment and encirclement. Among the most destabilized groups were women between the ages of 16 and 45, the demographic that had carried much of Germany's war economy. They had worked in factories, farms, postal services, and anti-aircraft batteries. Many were mobilized into the Reichsarbeitsdienst, or local Volkssturm auxiliaries, and others served as clerks, nurses, messengers, or Luftwaffe support staff. When the regime collapsed, these same women suddenly found themselves without legal protection, income, or safe shelter. American intelligence reports from April to June 1945 logged a sharp rise in unattached female civilians moving between cities in search of bread, a bed, or lost relatives. Some traveled with refugee columns escaping the east. Others were evacuated from bombed towns. Thousands more were simply swept up by advancing U.S. infantry units who could not immediately determine whether they were harmless civilians, uniformed personnel who discarded insignia, or members of Nazi organizations. This administrative uncertainty is what placed many of them inside temporary POW structures. American field commanders in places like Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg were suddenly responsible for areas containing tens of thousands of civilians whose identities were unknown. Orders instructed them to conduct broad sweeps of administrative buildings, military depots, and communication centers. Anyone found working in those facilities, male or female, was placed under custody until their role in the Nazi system was clarified. As a result, thousands of German women entered POW or internee status, not because they were frontline soldiers, but because the U.S. Army required time to examine their affiliations. The most common categories included Luftwaffe Helferinnen, female auxiliaries who worked with searchlights, communications, or flak batteries, administrative staff of Wehrmacht headquarters, nurses attached to military hospitals, clerks in logistics or signals units, women suspected of participation in Nazi Party offices or propaganda bureaus. Many of these women insisted they had been compelled into service, but the Americans could not simply take verbal claims at face value. Until documentation was verified, they were treated under the Geneva Convention framework applicable to POW labor, meaning they could be assigned work considered non-dangerous, non-military, and directly necessary for maintaining the occupying force. This is how the cleaning assignments began. By June 1945, American units converting former Wehrmacht installations into their own barracks found them filled with debris, unwashed latrines, broken equipment, and months of accumulated filth from retreating German personnel. Military administrators preferred to keep combat troops rested for redeployment or occupation tasks, not placed into fatigue work. Meanwhile, thousands of detained German women were sitting in improvised holding areas, waiting for identity checks, food distribution, and paperwork processing. The logic of the moment, efficient, unsentimental, and deeply shaped by the raw emotions of recent combat, created a policy that was technically lawful under the rules of war, but psychologically devastating for those forced into it. Female detainees were marched into former German garrisons, now bearing American flags, handed brushes, buckets, and disinfectant, and instructed to scrub every surface until it was suitable for U.S. troops to move in. Reports from the U.S. Third Army's military government detachments noted that many of these women were visibly humiliated. by the task, especially when required to clean barracks once used by elite Wehrmacht units. To them, it was not merely labor. It was a symbolic reversal of power, performed in front of armed Americans who had defeated the nation they had been taught to believe was invincible. For the American soldiers observing these scenes, the imagery carried its own emotional weight. Many had fought through the Hurtgen Forest, the Ardennes, the Saar, or the Rhine. They had lost friends. They had liberated concentration camps. Their perception of German civilians, including women, was shaped by shock, grief, and anger at what they had uncovered in places like Buchenwald, Dachau, and Ohrdruf. This did not justify cruelty, but it shaped the atmosphere of the occupation. The women cleaning the barracks were not told how long they would remain in custody. Some assumed it would be days, others feared months. Between cleaning shifts, they underwent interviews, screening, paperwork, and identification checks. A few were quickly released once civilian status was confirmed. Others were held longer due to their roles in military communication networks or Nazi party structures. Every hour of sweeping, scrubbing, or hauling water reinforced the reality that their world, the world Hitler promised would last 1,000 years, had ended not only in defeat but in humiliation. And this humiliation, recorded in diaries, letters, and U.S. archival notes, sets the stage for the deeper human and tactical angles of the story. Which brings us naturally into the next part, where we explore the multi-layered perspectives, the emotional, strategic, and psychological dimensions shaping the experience. For the German women compelled to clean American barracks, the humiliation was not rooted in the physical act of scrubbing floors. It was the symbolism. Days earlier, they had lived in a society where propaganda described them as pillars of the Reich, mothers of the nation, keepers of German virtue, and, for auxiliaries, honorable supporters of the war effort. Now they found themselves on their knees, wiping the boots marks of those who had conquered them. The emotional shock was profound. Many had never interacted closely with Americans before. To some, the sight of relaxed, confident GIs, uniforms clean, weapons slung casually, cigarettes hanging from their lips, reinforced the magnitude of Germany's defeat. Others feared abuse, having been told for years that Allied soldiers would treat German women with brutality. The U.S. Army's behavior varied by unit and commander, but even in cases where no physical harm occurred, the psychological impact remained severe. Survival instincts overpowered pride. Women whispered among themselves, trading rumors about release dates or sympathetic American officers. Some tried to work quickly and avoid eye contact. Others broke down during interrogations, exhausted from hunger and fear. The humiliation also displaced identity. A former Luftwaffe telegrapher, now scrubbing latrines, could no longer rationalize her service as patriotic duty. A clerical assistant, once proud of her role in a signals regiment, now felt exposed, powerless, stripped of dignity. Diaries describe a numb, drifting emotional state, no longer soldiers, not yet civilians, held between worlds. This fragile human dimension is essential, because the next angle reveals the mindset of the Americans overseeing them. A perspective molded by months of brutal combat. By the time U.S. troops entered southern Germany, they carried psychological burdens rarely acknowledged in post-war narratives. These men had fought through hedgerows, forests, and ruined industrial towns. They had seen friends killed by snipers, artillery, and last-ditch fanatics. They had liberated concentration camps whose horrors shattered any lingering sense that German civilians were uninvolved. So when American units encountered groups of German women wearing remnants of auxiliary insignia, or found working desks in abandoned Wehrmacht facilities. Suspicion was instinctive. These were not innocent bystanders in their eyes. They were part of a machine that had supported the war. Most soldiers did not mistreat the detainees, but they maintained emotional distance. Orders were clear: keep POWs working, maintain discipline, avoid unnecessary contact, report all incidents. Still, the atmosphere was tense. Women performing cleaning duties were watched closely. Any hesitation or complaint risked being interpreted as defiance. At the same time, many American soldiers felt conflicted. Letters home mentioned sympathy. They look scared. They're just girls. They're hungry too. But fatigue dulled compassion. These same men were occupying a ruined country while longing to go home. Cleaning barracks was low priority for them. Handing that work to detainees felt efficient and justified. There was also a symbolic dimension. Watching former Nazi auxiliaries scrub the floors of a garrison they once indirectly served in felt like an inversion of power, a quiet, unspoken retribution for the destruction the Wehrmacht had caused across Europe. This mixture of empathy, bitterness, caution, and exhaustion shaped the tone of the occupation, and it leads directly into the moral angle, where legality and humiliation collided in ways still debated today. Legally, the U.S. Army stood on firm ground. Under the 1929 Geneva Convention, governing POW treatment during World War II, fatigue duties were explicitly permitted, including cleaning, maintenance, and other non-military tasks. The work could not be dangerous or abusive, and detainees had to be provided food, shelter, and humane supervision. On paper, the system followed these rules. In practice, the moral terrain was more complicated. Many of the German women detained in 1945 were not frontline fighters. Some were coerced into service. Others simply worked administrative jobs. Their classification as POWs, even temporarily, blurred the line between actual combat participation and the broader machinery of the German war effort. Assigning them to clean American barracks carried an undeniable punitive undertone. It was labor enforced under the authority of a victorious army, performed by a defeated population who understood that resistance was futile. Even if not intended as deliberate humiliation, the emotional impact was unavoidable. The Americans justified it as necessity. Troops needed functioning facilities. Detainees needed structured activity. The war had only just ended, and chaos threatened stability. Like German society interpreted it differently. For a people raised under militaristic, rigid social norms, where women were taught to preserve modesty and uphold national dignity, performing scrubbing labor under the eyes of foreign soldiers cut deeply. It challenged the cultural foundation they had been conditioned to uphold. This moral tension, legal on one side, humiliating on the other, remained a quiet, unresolved chapter of the occupation, and it sets the stage for the next angle: how this episode reshaped the women's understanding of the regime they had once served. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda had promised German women that they were protected, honored, and destined to be the backbone of a powerful Reich. Even female auxiliaries, serving in communication or anti-aircraft roles, were told they were participating in a noble national mission. But defeat removes illusions with ruthless clarity. Inside American barracks, forced to clean floors, latrines, and living quarters, many women experienced what post-war psychologists later described as belief shock, the sudden collapse of ideological certainty. The Reich had assured them that Germany would triumph, that foreigners were inferior, that loyalty guaranteed security. Yet here they were, silent, exhausted, under guard, performing the lowest tasks not for German officers, but for foreign soldiers speaking a language they barely understood. A few had already doubted the regime after months of bombing or witnessing the desperation of late-war mobilization. But occupation accelerated the disillusionment. Some broke down crying during interrogations because they realized that the state they had supported had left them unprotected. Others expressed bitterness at Nazi officials who fled, leaving civilians to face the consequences. Cleaning American barracks functioned as a symbolic confrontation, the moment when ideology met reality, and reality was undeniable. And this psychological rupture, for both detainees and their captors, brings us to a deeper examination of the remaining angles described in the structure. To understand why German women ended up cleaning American barracks, one must see the occupation the way the U.S. Army did, as a massive logistical operation unfolding in a devastated country. When American forces captured German garrisons, they inherited not functional bases, but wrecked infrastructure. Smashed windows, overflowing latrines, collapsed ceilings, abandoned equipment, and piles of debris left behind by retreating German units. Some facilities had gone weeks without water or electricity. Others were contaminated by fuel spills, rotting food, or human waste. At this moment, the U.S. Army was stretched thin. Combat divisions had lost men through months of fighting, and replacements were limited. Units were preparing for possible redeployment to the Pacific. Commanders could not afford to assign riflemen, exhausted infantry who had survived the Ardennes, the Rhine crossings, and the Ruhr pocket to menial cleanup tasks. Those soldiers were needed for security patrols, demobilization planning, and guarding supply routes. At the same time, POW and internee populations had swollen far beyond expectations. American planners anticipated 1 to 2 million captives. They ended up securing more than 5 million across their occupation zone. Every day required food, shelter, interviews, and paperwork. Under Geneva Convention rules, detainees could legally be tasked with fatigue duties essential to the occupying forces functioning. Cleaning barracks fell squarely into that category. Thus, from the American viewpoint, the assignments were straightforward, practical, and necessary. But for the women themselves, this tactical inevitability did not diminish the sting of humiliation. The Army's need for labor collided with the emotional scars of defeat, creating a moment where logic and suffering coexisted, a tension that becomes clearer when we examine the broader societal impact. Within German towns, rumors spread quickly. Civilians whispered about the women taken to American camps or the girls forced to clean the barracks. Some believed the work was punishment for serving the Nazi state. Others feared far worse, imagining violence or exploitation. Because few people knew the exact conditions, stories mixed fact and speculation, fueled by anxiety and shame. For the families of these women, the humiliation was twofold. First, there was the shock of seeing daughters, sisters, or wives, some still wearing pieces of their auxiliary uniforms, escorted by American soldiers. Second, there was the social stigma. Even when women were released after screenings, neighbors sometimes viewed them with suspicion, wondering whether they had collaborated with the regime too closely or suffered indignities in captivity. This internal judgment contrasted sharply with the narrative Germany would adopt in later decades. Post-war society increasingly emphasized German suffering, bombings, expulsions, starvation. But in 1945, the emotional climate was different. Many civilians blamed the regime, not the Allies, for their misery. Some even viewed the cleaning duties as a symbolic cleansing of the national conscience, a tangible reminder of the disaster Germany had brought upon itself. For the women who performed the work, however, the experience remained deeply personal. They rarely spoke of it after the war. Many avoided discussing their auxiliary roles altogether. Some never told their children. Silence became a method of self-protection, a way to bury a chapter that felt both shameful and misunderstood. And it is precisely within this silent space, between occupation, humiliation, and the collapse of an entire worldview, that the story reaches its turning point. By early June 1945, the American occupation of southern Germany had stabilized in terms of territory, but tensions simmered quietly inside barracks across Bavaria. These structures, once symbols of Wehrmacht discipline, pride, and military order, now served as temporary homes for American companies and administrative units. Every day, German women assigned to clean and maintain these buildings confronted a stark reversal of power. The conquerors lived and worked in spaces that had once belonged to their own nation's military, while they were reduced to laboring under surveillance. One former Luftwaffe auxiliary, 19-year-old Helga M., recalled entering a barracks outside Ingolstadt, her hands raw from previous cleaning shifts. The long wooden corridors were cluttered with the remnants of German units that had fled in the preceding days. Crates of maps soaked in rain, discarded helmets, shredded uniforms, and broken furniture stacked haphazardly against walls. The smell of damp wood and rot filled the rooms, mingling with the faint stench of fuel and human waste. The task before her was not only physically exhausting but emotionally overwhelming. Every sweep of her broom, every scrub of a floorboard reminded her of the power shift that had overtaken Germany. In one hallway, tension reached its peak. A group of women hesitated at the doorway to a storage room overflowing with debris, unsure how to proceed. The American sergeant in charge interpreted hesitation as defiance. His voice, sharp and commanding, cut through the air, ordering the women forward. One young detainee, trembling and exhausted, stepped back instinctively. The sergeant's frustration escalated. A second soldier, noticing the fear and exhaustion, intervened, reminding him that the women had been working continuously for hours. The moment hung suspended in tension, a collision of authority, fatigue, and human vulnerability. Inside the storage room, the physical and symbolic weight of defeat became undeniable. Crates were toppled accidentally, splintered wood cut fingers, dust and ash made the women cough. Each movement carried the dual burden of labor and humiliation. The sergeant, breathing heavily, realized that excessive force would provoke panic, potentially disrupting the fragile order of the occupation. He stepped back, recalibrating his approach. Instructions were repeated calmly, tools redistributed, and the women resumed work under careful supervision. The fragile equilibrium, authority tempered by caution, was restored, but the psychological imprint on all present was lasting. Elsewhere, in towns like Regensburg and Würzburg, similar incidents unfolded. Some barracks saw minor confrontations, others went smoothly, but the pattern was consistent. The moment of surrender had transformed into a prolonged, intimate confrontation with defeat. For the American soldiers, these interactions tested patience, discipline, and the limits of authority. For the German women, they crystallized the human and cultural cost of losing a war that had promised national triumph but delivered personal humiliation. It was inside these corridors, under the watchful eyes of armed occupiers, that a deeper understanding of the war's consequences emerged. Cleaning was no longer a mundane task. It had become an act charged with symbolic meaning. Each floor scrubbed and window polished represented not just physical restoration, but the imposition of a new world order, one in which victory and survival dictated human interactions in ways that blurred legality, morality, and emotion. The experience of the women in these barracks stands as a concentrated moment of post-war reckoning. It illuminates the fragile balance between authority and compassion, legality and humiliation, necessity and empathy. In these early weeks of occupation, the war had ended, but its psychological and social aftershocks were still being measured, one floorboard, one bucket, one scrubbed wall at a time. And as these small but intense moments accumulated, they set the stage for the decisive turning point in both the women's understanding of defeat and the American Army's approach to managing the conquered population. By mid-June 1945, the initial shock of surrender had evolved into a structured, tense routine. American barracks in southern Germany had become microcosms of post-war order, blending military necessity with the fraught presence of defeated civilians. Among the most vivid scenes were those involving German women assigned to clean, restore, and maintain these facilities. What had begun as labor driven by practicality had grown into a complex interplay of authority, humiliation, and human resilience. One barracks near Regensburg illustrates this vividly. The building had previously housed Wehrmacht communications personnel. Long corridors lined with desks, filing cabinets, and maps bore the marks of hurried evacuation. Torn files, overturned chairs, and remnants of rations scattered on the floor. A group of 20 German women, some barely 16, others in their early 40s, were tasked with restoring these spaces for incoming American troops. Buckets of water, mops, brushes, and soap were their only tools. The day began quietly. The women moved through the corridors in single file, scrubbing floors, dusting shelves, and carrying out debris. Their hands blistered, backs ached, faces remained pale from exhaustion. The American sergeant overseeing the work walked slowly, clipboard in hand, occasionally issuing short instructions in broken German. The women obeyed, silently noting every gesture, every command, understanding that their position was precarious. Tension escalated when a corner of the building revealed a heap of soaked documents and broken crates that needed immediate removal. Several women hesitated. One girl stepped back, her foot landing on a splintered plank. Another muttered an incomprehensible phrase in her Bavarian dialect. The sergeant's frustration flared. To him, hesitation suggested defiance. He raised his voice sharply, and the room froze. Dust hung in the air, catching the sunlight filtering through cracked windows. A crucial intervention came from a subordinate American soldier who recognized that the women were physically and emotionally drained. He motioned to the sergeant, urging patience. The tension broke slowly, like a receding tide. Orders became calmer, movements more deliberate. The women resumed their tasks, but with heightened awareness. Every action carried symbolic weight. They were cleaning not only the barracks, but the remnants of a regime that had promised them security, respect, and national pride, all of which had vanished. Other barracks experienced similar turning points. In Würzburg, women assigned to scrub kitchens and latrines initially resisted or worked haltingly, only to be reassigned in a structured rotation that allowed brief rest periods. American soldiers, observing the patterns of fatigue and confusion, adjusted supervision methods. Authority was maintained, but rigid enforcement gave way to measured oversight. These moments underscored a larger lesson for both sides. Occupation required balance, not brute control. The climax of these experiences was not a battle in the traditional sense, but a confrontation between expectation and reality. For the women, it was the moment when the collapse of their world became tangible, immediate, and inescapable. For the American soldiers, it was a test of discipline, empathy, and practical command. How to assert authority over a defeated population while preventing disorder, injury, or unnecessary suffering. By the end of June, routines had settled into a fragile equilibrium. The barracks were clean, functional, and organized. German women had learned the limits of their autonomy. American soldiers had learned the limits of their authority. The work had been exhausting, humiliating, but also instructive. It revealed the psychological dimensions of defeat, the subtle interplay of gender, culture, and military hierarchy, and the moral ambiguities inherent in the first weeks of occupation. And it was within this charged environment that the consequences of these interactions began to take root, shaping not only immediate behavior, but long-term perceptions, social dynamics, and historical memory. By late June 1945, the initial flurry of cleaning, registration, and provisional labor had subsided. The American Army had succeeded in restoring functional barracks across Bavaria, Württemberg, and Hesse, and the immediate threat of disorder within these facilities was largely under control. But the human consequences of these early weeks of occupation were only beginning to reveal themselves. For the German women who had performed cleaning duties, the experience left both physical and psychological marks. Hands were chapped or scarred from repeated contact with soap, water, and harsh scrubbing materials. Exhaustion was pervasive. Many had been awake before dawn and worked until evening under constant supervision. Some reported stomach illnesses due to inadequate food during transit or in holding areas. Yet the more enduring impact was emotional. Humiliation, anxiety, and the acute awareness of powerlessness. Diaries from former auxiliaries recall quiet moments of despair, whispered exchanges of worry, and the sense that their world, the one promised to them by a regime they had served faithfully, had ended in small, repetitive acts of labor under foreign eyes. American records corroborate the presence of this emotional tension. Field reports often note women visibly intimidated, fatigued but compliant, or shaken by the process of enforced labor. While there were no widespread instances of abuse in documented accounts, the combination of strict authority, unfamiliar language, and the reversal of hierarchy produced a form of psychological stress that left lasting impressions. Occupation forces observed, logged, and adjusted practices, striving to maintain Geneva Convention standards while meeting operational needs. The aftermath extended beyond the barracks themselves. In local German communities, awareness of women being used in this way spread quickly. Families worried about safety and reputation. Some viewed the labor as punitive justice for association with the military or auxiliary services. Others understood it as administrative necessity imposed by victorious forces. This tension created subtle social stigma, particularly for women who had been visibly employed in auxiliary or administrative roles. Even after release, many were reluctant to speak of the experience, quietly internalizing the shame or discomfort, contributing to a broader culture of silence about the war's final months. At the same time, the American Army began to reflect on policy effectiveness. Commanders observed that careful supervision, clear instructions, and rotation schedules minimized resistance and accidents. They recognized that overbearing enforcement could provoke panic or even unrest, while measured authority fostered compliance and reduced tension. These lessons were applied across other facilities in southern Germany and informed early guidelines for post-war civilian labor and internment management. Strategically, the barracks cleaning episodes illustrated the broader reality of occupation. Victory in battle did not equate to immediate control over population behavior or morale. Labor assignments, even lawful and necessary, carried symbolic weight. They influenced perceptions of power, ethics, and national identity, both for those performing the work and those observing it. The act of cleaning became a quiet, repetitive reminder of Germany's collapse and the new order imposed by the Allied forces. These early weeks of enforced labor also presaged larger post-war challenges. As millions of displaced persons, POWs, and civilians were relocated, the U.S. Army had to navigate not only logistics, but human dignity, morality, and international law. Every bucket of water, mop stroke, and polished floorboard served as a microcosm of these complex dynamics. Practical necessity intertwined with human consequence. And as the dust settled in these barracks, the story of humiliation, authority, and survival transitioned from immediate struggle to long-term memory, shaping how the women themselves, their families, and the post-war world would interpret these small but profound acts of occupation labor. By July 1945, months after the surrender, the American occupation had shifted from immediate stabilization to systematic administration. The barracks were fully operational, serving as command posts, supply depots, and temporary housing for troops managing civilian populations. The German women who had cleaned these facilities had largely been released or reassigned, yet the effects of their labor lingered in both physical scars and social memory. For the women, reintegration into civilian life was uneven. Some returned to families and communities grateful for their survival, yet subtly altered by the experience of humiliation. Others faced suspicion from neighbors who associated auxiliary roles with complicity in the Nazi war effort. Diaries and memoirs from the period describe lingering shame, fear of judgment, and a quiet sense of dislocation. Even women in their early 20s found themselves reconsidering identities forged under 12 years of totalitarian indoctrination. Labor under the eyes of American soldiers had reinforced the collapse of old certainties. What had been honorable service was reframed as powerless subjugation for American forces. The aftermath was instructive. Officers compiled reports noting that labor assignments were effective in restoring order, but they also highlighted psychological vulnerabilities. Women forced into labor were compliant but anxious, often fatigued and prone to minor accidents which demanded oversight. Commanders concluded that balancing authority with care minimized risks of unrest while maintaining operational efficiency. These lessons informed policies for handling civilian internees and prisoners in both urban and rural zones across occupied Germany. In essence, small acts of occupation, scrubbing floors, washing latrines, cleaning furniture, became part of the Army's broader approach to governance. The episode also had broader cultural and historical implications. In post-war Germany, the experience of forced labor for women auxiliaries was rarely discussed openly. Silence served as a protective mechanism. Acknowledging humiliation or powerlessness risked social shame or misinterpretation. Yet these moments were crucial in shaping the collective memory of defeat, particularly among women who had contributed to the war effort without bearing arms. Their enforced labor represented both the practical realities of occupation and the symbolic dismantling of a society that had glorified obedience and national pride. Historians later analyzed these events as microcosms of the war's final consequences, the intersection of military necessity, human vulnerability, and moral complexity. The women's labor highlighted the ethical ambiguity of post-conflict authority. Legal, practical, and operational imperatives collided with personal dignity and cultural expectations. The barracks, once symbols of German military efficiency, were repurposed as tools for reasserting Allied control. Their cleanliness, a metaphor for the broader imposition of order on a defeated nation. Ultimately, the aftermath illustrates the dual nature of occupation. One side focused on practical efficiency and compliance. The other endured emotional and social upheaval. The story of German women cleaning American barracks reminds us that victory is never solely measured in territory or surrender documents. It is measured in the quiet, often invisible moments that define human experience, power, and the reshaping of societies in the wake of conflict. This period set the stage for reflection, a calm, philosophical closure that examines the broader meaning of these events for history, warfare, and humanity itself. The story of German women compelled to clean American barracks is, at first glance, a minor footnote in the vast theater of World War II. Yet, when examined closely, it becomes a lens through which the complexity of defeat, occupation, and human resilience can be understood. These women were neither combatants nor willing prisoners. They were civilians caught in the machinery of war, thrust into roles that forced them to confront humiliation, authority, and the collapse of everything they had once been taught to value. Their labor was both practical and symbolic. Each sweep of a floor, each polished desk, and each cleaned latrine was a tangible act of rebuilding, not only of physical spaces, but of social order imposed by the victors. It was a reminder that the consequences of war extend beyond battlefields and strategic maps. They reach into the daily, intimate rhythms of life, shaping identity, perception, and memory. The act of cleaning, simple in its physicality, became a conduit for reflection on power, submission, and survival. For the American soldiers, the experience reinforced the delicate balance required in post-war governance. Authority could not rely on brute force alone. It demanded awareness, restraint, and an understanding of human vulnerability. The occupation was as much a psychological and moral challenge as it was a logistical one. Lessons learned from these early weeks informed later policies for managing prisoners, displaced civilians, and the broader population of a defeated Germany. Historically, these moments serve as a reminder that victory carries responsibility. The legal framework of the Geneva Convention provided structure, but the ethical weight of human dignity remained an invisible burden. In the silence of the barracks, amid mops and buckets, the war's end was felt not through triumph, but through small, repetitive acts that measured the cost of defeat, both for the occupied and the occupiers. And so the story concludes quietly, with the women returning to their communities, their identities altered, their dignity tested, yet their survival a testament to endurance. The barracks remained, orderly and functional, a monument to the intersection of necessity, power, and human resilience, a subtle but profound echo of the war itself.